from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting in Atlanta, this is Lawmakers. For March 26, 2010, the 30th legislative day of the Georgia General Assembly. Here are your hosts.
And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Lawmakers on this 30th legislative day. Both the House and the Senate, as you see, they're still in session at this hour. On crossover day, this is the day when, of course, a bill must pass either chamber in order to assure final passage during this particular session. Good evening. I'm in Wandy Lawson. Also coming up on tonight's program, the Senate passes a measure making it a crime to coerce an abortion for any reason.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan Hoffman. As you can tell, I am live at the Capitol. Also in tonight's program, we're going to, of course, check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. But our top story for you tonight, the governor's bed tax, the hospital provider fee, does pass the House this afternoon. The House says yes to the governor's bed tax, provider fee, whatever you'd like to call it. Essentially, it's a 1.45% on the net revenues, the patient revenues from a hospital. Jim Cole, the governor's floor leader, presented the bill. Take a look.
Last year, the governor kind of dropped this bill to say, listen, I'm looking 2-3 years ahead of time. Things are going to get pretty rough. 2012 is going to be a rough year. So House Bill 307 would provide a provider payment agreement amount of 1.45% that is assessed on the net patient revenue of hospitals. Net patient revenue means the total gross patient revenue less contractual adjustments, charity care, bad debt, and indigent care. 30C also exempts the following: critical access hospitals, psychiatric and state-owned facilities. 307 also contains a sunset. It will become effective July 1st, 2010, and will sunset June 30th, 2013. The funds collected are deposited in a segregated account within the Indigent Care Trust Fund. The funds shall then be appropriated by the General Assembly for the purpose of Medicaid services and rate increases.
When all is said and done, this should generate about $700 million for the state per year. That is, of course, after the drawdown monies come from the federal government. It's a 1-to-3 match. I should also point out that Representative Earl Earhart wanted to amend the bill, and he was successful. He wanted to exempt the AMSURG centers. These ambulatory surgery centers are doctor-owned centers that are separate from hospitals, and generally speaking, these centers don't take indigent patients. So ultimately, they were exempt. Earl Earhart's amendment did pass. The bill went on to pass very easily after all the backbiting and the battling over it. Was kind of surprising because, again, it did pass very easily. The hospital bed tax provider fee bill now moves to the Senate.
And in other news, the scandal which preceded the resignation of former House Speaker Glenn Richardson has raised some cries for ethics reform. Yesterday, a House committee approved a measure intended to create more transparency in state government. Lawmakers' Valerie Edwards joins us live from the Capitol with more on that measure. Valerie.
In Wandy, the current House Speaker David Ralston promised sweeping ethics reforms when he took office. Well, it appears this 38-page document, House Bill 1473, appears to do just that, but not just at the state level, at the local level as well. Let's start with a name change from the State Ethics Commission to the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission. Along with that comes a hefty hike in fines for ethics violations, nearly doubling in some instances. And there's more. Each year, every public official must file an affidavit swearing they took no official action in the previous year which affected their financial or business interests. With all of that, some still say the measure leaves too much out to be called true reform.
Well, it does not touch on the things that were abused that we had hoped to fix. It changes the name, it increases the fines, but when you have abuse of power, you've got to have something about sexual harassment. We put an amendment, it was defeated. It's got to have a gift ban. That was one of the things that was most abused. We put an amendment in, it was defeated.
How much input did your party have in this measure?
None. We were shown a bill the day of the committee hearing. We quickly scrambled around and got our amendments up.
I want to go back to this document for a moment and get at the heart of why many say ethics reform was needed. And it says to provide a method for addressing conflicts of interest, abuse of power, and improper use of state employees by the General Assembly. The newly named commission will consist of 5 members, 3 from the governor, 1 each from the House, 1 each from the Senate. Reporting live for Lawmakers, I'm Valerie Edwards.
All right, Valerie, thanks so much. We'll check in with you a little bit later.
All right, also in the House today, the House okays 3 different bills relating to fees that are charged by state agencies. The first is House Bill 1055, which essentially lays the groundwork to adjust 1,800 different fees. These, again, are state agency fees. In the end, it will generate $96 million, and you've probably heard about this. It's really all in an effort to balance the state budget, which, as you know, has a huge shortfall right now. Democrats really obviously didn't like the plan. They, as far as they're concerned, they're tax increases, and they would like to call them tax increases. Take a look.
It just simply identifies some of the 1,800 plus fees the state charges that need to be adjusted over the cost of the service provided. As we work through this bill, you will note that it is not very glamorous nor headline grabbing, simply applying an inflationary factor to some items that have not been updated in 10, 20, 30, 40, and like I said, in over 50 years.
If we've got to raise money for the budget, let's do it straight up and be honest with the public. If it takes a tax to do that, if it takes collecting those that are cheating on their sales tax, if we need to undo tax exemptions we've given that may not can afford or work anymore, or if there are other things that have been on the table of tobacco tax or anything else, at least with those you know you're straight up with your people on what you're doing.
Just to give you an example, in addition to the 1,800 fees, there are some new fees in here. For instance, lobbyists currently don't pay any money to register with the state. Now they will have to pay $300 before they can do business here. Child care centers should expect to pay their inspections as well. They say it'll be roughly $1 per child per year. So those are, again, some examples as to some new fees that are included in this bill. Again, the bill, House Bill 1055 passed 100 to 57. That bill moves to the Senate. Also in the House today, the House passed HB 1283. In fact, it barely squeaked by. The House Speaker had to cast the deciding vote. It came up 90. It needs 91 to pass, and he ended up casting that last vote. This bill calls on state agencies to essentially implement some type of review of all of their fees and make the appropriate adjustments. Again, that was HB 1283. That went on to pass. It moves to the Senate. Also in the House today, another bill that mandates that the Office of Planning and Budget actually keep track on a monthly basis of all the users' fees that the state agencies are charging, so they have some idea, again, on a monthly basis what is happening. That was House Bill 1284. It, too, moves to the Senate.
And in a party line vote today, the Senate agrees to prevent state agencies from implementing the new federal health care overhaul without General Assembly approval. Senator Judson Hill, who sponsors SB 399, said this would prevent the state from footing the bill for frivolous health care. Now, the Democrats question whether the state has the right to keep consumers from acquiring their health care needs while they wait for the Senate or wait for the General Assembly to reconvene next January.
Federal law cannot be implemented if it relates to health care unless the Department of Community Health reports to the General Assembly, first, what is required and how it must be implemented, second, the impact of the state, third, the cost to the state, such as like a health care fiscal note is really what this is getting at. And if the report is not made to the legislature, then the federal law cannot be implemented in the state of Georgia.
The Senate Democrat leader chided his colleagues for supporting the race to the top federal education plan while dismissing federal health care reform.
I wonder why President Obama is such a saint in the classroom and such a sinner in the hospital room. I don't understand that. Now, here we are moving through the other body, and as I understand it, we are just chomping at the bits to be able to pass a sick tax. We want to pass a hospital tax. That's our health care program in Georgia?
SB 399 did pass the Senate by a vote of 30 to 16. That measure now moves to the House.
And speaking of the House, Austin Scott, as you may know, is a Republican candidate for governor. Well, today he dropped a resolution that was signed by the House Speaker David Ralston. And essentially this resolution is a joint resolution. And the resolution mandates that the Attorney General file suit against the federal government in the wake of the health care mandates that came down this week. According to Austin Scott and according to the Speaker's office, a spokesperson in the Speaker's office, if this joint resolution, which is a special resolution, were to pass the House, pass the Senate, and then be signed by the governor, it could in fact become effective in law. It may not be on the books, but it would in fact be effective, and it would force Attorney General Thurber Baker's hand to again file suit, as the governor, as you know, has already requested. You're going to hear from Austin Scott. Following Austin Scott, you're going to hear from Representative DeVos Porter. He is also a candidate for governor on the Democratic side, and he again believes that this is just grandstanding. It's not going to go anywhere. It's the 30th legislative day, and that the State House and State Senate should be focusing on state issues. Take a look.
As most of you know, I introduced a resolution this morning. It is signed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and a total of 33 representatives have joined me in this resolution that will actually demand that the Attorney General join the lawsuit against the federal government in the health care legislation. If it is passed by the House and passed by the Senate, signed by the governor, it will have the effect of law, and the Georgia Constitution reads that the Attorney General of Georgia shall perform such duties as shall be required by law. I believe that if this is passed and signed, that he will have no choice but to join the lawsuit and work to protect the citizens of the state of Georgia and their 10th Amendment rights.
Now, what happened in Washington, a lot of Georgians agree with, a lot disagree. But we don't need to spend money here in Georgia fighting something that we can't control. Other attorney generals have filed that. Let them pay for it. Let them pay for the lawyers. Because it'll be decided in that forum whether we're there or not.
I'm going to remind you again, it's the 30th legislative day, so for a bill or a resolution to move from the House to Senate would have to happen today. To my knowledge, and I have asked, there is no vehicle to lop this resolution onto, so if it doesn't move, nothing's going to happen. I should also point out that the Attorney General's office has issued sort of a loose statement today commenting on this bill or on this resolution. I've already given you my opinion. Thurber Baker said I've already given you my opinion, and I'm hoping that lawmakers will trust that I have given good, legal, sound advice, that there is no viable legal leg to stand on to file this suit. And of course, if the story continues to unfold, we'll bring you the latest.
All right, and the bill that could give a doctor the right to prevent a woman from having an abortion was hotly debated on the Senate floor this afternoon. Senate Bill 529 would make performing an abortion an illegal offense if the doctor knowingly performs the abortion knowing that the woman was coerced based on race or gender of the unborn child. Lawmakers' Laura Fawaz has more on the story.
If there's one thing that we can do as legislators to protect the next generations of Georgians who will come behind us, it is to make efforts to make sure that abortions are rare, they're uncoerced, and that they're not done to promote some type of agenda based upon the gender or the race of the child.
This bill is just going to set up a lot of lawsuits. It's going to set up an unnecessary and it is going to be unconstitutional set of paperwork that we're going to be asking minority women apparently to fill out.
This decision about abortion is absolutely a decision that you have the right to make in private. This bill and others like it have been brought to us by a crowd, I like to call them the right to run your life crowd.
Senate Bill 529 did pass 33-14, and a press conference was held after the vote.
So anyone who stands in favor of allowing people to abort children based on coercion cannot call themselves pro-choice. So clearly coercion should be outlawed. And then the second issue is, do you abort and end the life of a child based on that child's gender or race? That is barbaric.
Reporting for Lawmakers, I'm Laura Fawaz.
Also today, the House passes 1405, House Bill 1405. It was presented by the Ways and Means Chair, Larry O'Neill, Representative Larry O'Neill. As he presented it, he basically explained that we need a blue ribbon committee to look at our tax structure, our revenue structure. In short, this study committee will work throughout 2010, and by January of 2011, they will have some type of report filed back to legislators, and possibly some legislation as how we should bring our tax code into the current day. Take a look at Representative Larry O'Neill.
We don't believe that our code is as good as it could be to keep up with the growth in this state. We'll be considering the economy in the state of Georgia. That's changed radically, as all of us are painfully aware, in the last 2 or 3 years, and the direction of our economy. We'll be considering the citizens and business attitudes toward our taxes. That has a lot to do with our ability to exact compliance with the code. We'll be considering the burden of taxation on Georgia citizens. We'll be comparing the position of Georgia versus other states in this study. And we'll have individual tax and revenue analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, over the years, past 50 or 60 years, we've cobbled together a code on a piecemeal basis with some 118 exemptions that I know about. There may actually be more than those, all of which need to be evaluated on both a quantitative and qualitative basis.
House Bill 1405 did pass 111 to 55, but a couple of points to make here. Early in the day, House members decided to limit debate on bills to 1 hour. Well, Democrats were irritated, particularly over a few things, such as this potential lawsuit against the federal government in the wake of the health care mandates. Well, they were trying to stop down debate, and they were using all the time they possibly could at the washroom, at the well rather, really kind of holding things up. And it was during this time it became very obvious to House members that Democrats were going to do everything they could to slow down the calendar. Particularly on this bill, though, they did complain that there were no women and no minorities, no African Americans or Asians or Latinos to be placed on this blue ribbon tax committee, and that is something that they did take a lot of time to point out again as they attempted to slow debate. So in short, 1405, House Bill 1405 passes relatively easily. It moves to the Senate.
All right, Susan, and while we're talking taxes, those who in the state who say that the state should not collect ad valorem taxes when there's at least a $500 million in the rainy day fund are unable to garner the supermajority needed to get Senate Resolution 1287 through the Senate today. Now, that resolution was defeated by a vote of 31 to 15. The Senate agreed to reconsider its action, and that measure went back to rules. And as of this hour, we are still waiting for that resolution to return to the floor. Meanwhile, companion legislation, SB 517, passed just after 6 p.m. That vote was 31 to 14, sending the measure to the House. And the Senate did agree to authorize the Department of Revenue to negotiate sales tax collection on Internet sales. Why would companies voluntarily comply with these tax collections? Here's Appropriations Chair Jack Hill.
What this does is allow the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue to go out and offer a company that is presently not collecting tax but making sales within the state, and the most identifiable avenue is e-retailers, offer them a higher collection fee in return for them collecting sales tax for Georgia residents.
Still, there were some who questioned why the state didn't try to do a better job of collecting point-of-sale taxes instead of going after e-retailers.
If a retailer does not have a nexus in Georgia, they are not required to collect the tax, and the Quill Supreme Court decision in fact restated that they are not required to collect the tax, and therefore they have no incentive to collect the tax. So even if we go after them and say, please collect the tax, they're going to say no. But if we go to them and say, please collect the tax and here's what we'll do for you, they may say yes. And that's really all this bill does.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
We're all trying to understand. Still, the question begs, why do we not go and negotiate with them now? I think in fact, that's what the chairman's first suggestion to the Revenue Commissioner was, and I don't know why we didn't go that route.
There's nothing to negotiate with them. I mean, we can't, they're not required to collect the tax. And under this bill, we would be able to begin negotiating with them and say, if you're willing to collect the tax, here's what we can do for you. Nobody knows what that would be at this point. But without this bill, we're not even allowed to go negotiate with them because we have no standing.
And SB 512 passed 45 to 4 and moves over to the House.
And now I need to clarify an item that we reported on Wednesday night's broadcast. House Bill 1199, which allows for the Department of Natural Resources to undertake certain privatization measures, passed the House Wednesday. I reported that the bill would grant corporations that are donors to a nonprofit foundation benefiting the DNR naming rights to Georgia state parks. Well, HB 1199, in fact, doesn't grant corporate donors naming rights. The confusion arose because there's a separate request for proposal issued by the DNR that seeks to establish a relationship between the DNR and a marketing firm to seek private sector partners to support Georgia state parks. That RFP, as it's called, is not a legislative measure, and the DNR says that selling naming rights to any portion of the parks is not the intent of that RFP. I regret the error.
And now we go to Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. He, like the rest of us, has been following the action here on Crossover Day all day and joins us live from the Capitol. Hey, Tom.
Hey.
You know, we've heard a lot today, obviously, about ways to fix the budget with fees and taxes and otherwise. Not a lot of direct discussion of the budget itself, however, but a lot of movement along with the hospital fees and in other fees.
That's right, and they're waiting. The people writing the budget were waiting until they could get past day 30 and get a decision on whether these tax and fee measures were going to be passed, which they were. It looks like they're going to move forward and raise some extra revenue for the budget, so that makes their job at least a little bit easier when they get down to working more on the budget next week.
Now, hospitals were coming into this kicking and screaming, saying it was going to be a very bitter pill to take. At this point, do you see the legislation moving through the General Assembly with a little less reticence on their part?
I think so. The hospitals have basically said this is a bad option, but the other options out there are worse. So if this is what it takes to keep from cutting Medicaid payments to us, we can live with it. They also got a promise that it would only be enacted for a 3-year period, at which time it'll phase out. So they're basically holding their noses and going along with it.
You know, we spent a considerable part of the afternoon over in the Senate debating SB 529. Senators really coming out with their positions on abortion around that matter.
That is always a hot button issue here, and it is the one that will get both sides arguing and fighting with each other. The approach being used by the anti-abortion movement is to equate abortion with black genocide and use that as a way to punish doctors who perform the abortion procedure and send them to prison for up to 10 years. A similar bill did not make it out of committee in the House. This bill might have a hard time in the House as well.
Well, in the few seconds that we do have left, we have heard a lot about opposition here to the federal health care mandate and some movement on the part of the governor's office, perhaps to try to challenge that in court.
A lot of people are upset about the health care reform plan on the Republican side. Governor Perdue has indicated he will hire his own attorney or retain his own attorney to challenge the constitutionality of the act in court. Several pieces of legislation are also being passed and proposed by Republican legislators to also show their displeasure with this particular action by President Obama.
All right, Tom, well, we appreciate you hanging in with us as you continue to cover the legislative action as well.
Great to be here.
In other news, with the passage this evening of Senate Bill 515, the Senate affirms that local school systems should use surplus revenues to keep teachers in the classroom on state-mandated furlough days. Senator Preston Smith disputed claims of local systems that the legislature is meddling in school district business.
If a school system has an unencumbered balance in a reserve fund of greater than 6%, then they should not furlough teachers during that fiscal year. That's the essence of the bill and the only thing that it seeks to achieve. It is seeking to evaluate whether or not there is a system that exists that has a large amount of unencumbered funds on reserve that is rolling from year to year, money that could be used to help pay for teacher salaries or other needs of the school system, but which is being saved instead, and the school system is furloughing teachers.
Now, although some large systems like Gwinnett County may have almost $150 million at the close of the fiscal year, Senate Education Chair Dan Weber explained that the money has strings attached.
Don't criticize the systems for having those large numbers on the paper at that point in time, because they have that money that is encumbered and to be used to pay for, first and foremost, teacher salaries in July and August before property tax revenues start coming in the fall.
Senate Bill 515 passed by a vote of 35 to 11. It moves to the House. And the Senate also agreed to take per diem away from school board members when their districts are on probation or have their accreditation revoked. SB 426 passed 47 to 0 and now requires House approval. SB 518 also now requires House approval.
And the Senate today passed a measure that would create a needs-based Hope Scholarship grant. Senate Bill 496 says that students who are eligible for the Pell Grant could also be eligible for an additional Hope Grant, whether they are already receiving a Hope Scholarship or not. Here are Senators Jack Hill and Bill Cowser discussing funding for the additional grants.
This appears to come from the Scholarship Shortfall Reserve. Would that be subject to the availability of funds, and would this in any way implement those triggers that we built in a few years ago?
As you know, the governor appropriates a lottery revenue estimate just like he does a general funds revenue estimate as well. Interestingly, he did appropriate more this year than the lottery will take in, about $190 million more. So the present budget presumes to start dipping into the reserves. As you and I both know, the reserves are over $900 million, so you know we have ample reserves for several years.
Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams offered an amendment to the bill concerning school principals' salary.
That one of our accrediting agencies required that the principal in the school make more money than the highest paid teacher. What I'm saying in this bill is that accrediting agencies should not make those decisions regarding salaries. That should be left up to either us or to the local boards.
Senate Bill 496 passes with the amendment. The vote on that was 45-4. The bill goes to the House.
The General Assembly moved one step closer to strengthening its control over DOT board members. Lawmakers Valerie Edwards has been covering transportation all session long, so we turn to her at the Capitol for the update. Valerie.
Thank you, Nwandi. Early in the session, we saw a bill out of the Senate to limit DOT board members to a 4-year term. Today, that measure was amended on the Senate floor so that a majority legislative vote could mean a recall for any board member. Here's one explanation for why some say the measure is needed.
Without a full-fledged impeachment, there's just no way of doing it, and that would have been a little too ridiculous to go through that process. This is the only board that the General Assembly gets to appoint, and there were no mechanisms to retrieve one if he or she again wasn't performing their duty, and this gives us that mechanism.
But not everyone agrees the power of recall is the right way to keep the DOT in check.
So I wanted to leave it in 5-year staggered terms appointed by the congressional delegations, but not with recalls built in so simply that once a week someone could get upset and want to recall their DOT board member, because I think you'd have chaos and probably have them jumping on the same string you had when the whole General Assembly controlled it.
In other transportation news, it appears a proposed 1% funding mechanism backed by Governor Sonny Perdue will go down to the wire. House Bill 1218 now resides in a joint conference committee.
All the other issues that came about, such as a local up approach versus a state down approach, legislative oversight, who was on the executive committee. Those are things that we can hash out and work on and try to come to a compromise. But the one issue that we cannot deal with is an opt-out.
We're just learning at this hour that HB 1218 is back on the calendar in the House. We'll have updates as soon as that becomes available. Live for Lawmakers, I'm Valerie Edwards.
All right, Valerie, thanks for that. Now we need to get news from around the state. For that, let's turn to Ricky Bevington.
Well, thank you, Nwandi, and good evening. The Savannah School Board has fired about 200 teachers and staff at Beach High School. This is a drastic move. It comes as the low-performing school tries to qualify for millions in federal No Child Left Behind funds. Critics say this move could leave students without support system, making it harder to learn. But at least one school board member says a fresh start will help. Teachers can reapply for their jobs, but federal law only allows about half of them to return. Georgia's embattled Attorney General Thurber Baker left politics behind yesterday to urge parents in Augusta to take a role in fighting gangs. He told the crowd that Augusta's recent upswing in gang activity can't be stopped by law enforcement alone. There's more Georgia News at gpb.org. I'm Ricky Bevington.
All right, Ricky, thank you so much for that update. And that is our broadcast for the 30th legislative day of the 2010 session. On behalf of Susan Hoffman and Nwandi Lawson, I would like to ask you to join us on Tuesday, March 30th for Lawmakers at 7 p.m. We take you live now to the General Assembly, where the House and Senate are still in session. All right, we're going to go to the House, I understand, which is still in session, and we hope you have a good weekend.
Funding for Lawmakers comes from
the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of Georgia's business community, over 4,000 members strong. working with lawmakers for over 90 years to make sure that our state remains a place where companies thrive.
And by supporters of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you.
This has been a production of Georgia Public Broadcasting.